What happens when a man who thinks the whole world owes him a listening ear sits across from a man who refuses to worship anyone? When Prince Harry walks into the Joe Rogan experience expecting another soft platform to repeat his grievances, he doesn't realize he's sitting inches away from someone who calls out excuses for a living. No audience, no palace, just a table, 2 microphones, and 3 hours that spiral from awkward to explosive until Joe finally says the words no royal has ever heard on air. You know what, man? I'm done. We're cutting this. The studio was dim, warm, and familiar to millions who only ever saw it through their screens. The neon signs hummed softly on the brick wall, a skull on one shelf, a row of supplements on another, 2 microphones, 2 headphones, a cluttered wooden table with ashtrays, half-drunk water bottles, and a stack of Joe Rogan's notes that looked suspiciously untouched. Joe slipped his headphones on, glanced at his producer through the glass, then turned toward his guest. 3, 2, 1, and we're live. He flashed his trademark grin. Prince Harry is in the building, ladies and gentlemen, or I should say Harry. You've been just Harry for a while now, right? Across from him, Harry adjusted his headset jaw tight. He wore a dark sweater, expensive but deliberately casual, as if he'd tried to dress like any other podcast guest, and still ended up looking like a royal trying to cosplay relatable. Yes, Harry replied. I gave up the titles, I've said that many times. Joe chuckled. Yeah, but you still put Prince in the book title, man. A tiny ripple of laughter came from the control room. Harry's eyes flicked toward the glass, then back to Joe. It's not my fault people don't know how to let go of labels, Harry said coolly. The name doesn't define me. Sure, Joe nodded, leaning back. So let's start there. If you don't care about the label, if you're done with the royal stuff, why are you here? Why come on the biggest podcast in the world and then talk about it again? There it was. First jab, nothing cruel, just pure Rogan. Casual, disarming, but with teeth. Harry smiled without warmth. I'm here because there's still a lot people don't understand. The narrative has been twisted. I'm tired of everyone else monetizing my story. Joe raised his eyebrows. Monetizing your story? Didn't you do a Netflix series, a book, a couple of documentaries? That's called reclaiming my voice. Harry cut in, his tone already sharper. There's a difference between profiting off lies and telling your truth. Joe tilted his head. Okay, but the outcome's the same, right? Cameras, deals, attention. You walked away from the crown, but walked straight into Hollywood. That's kind of a lateral move. Harry's jaw clenched. I didn't walk into Hollywood, I walked toward freedom. People like you love to pretend that if I speak, I must be chasing fame. I was born famous. I'm trying to survive it. Joe watched him for a moment. The way a fighter studies an opponent's stance before throwing the next punch. All right, he said. Let's talk about that. You say you're surviving fame, but man, you're still doing this. You're sitting here, cameras, millions watching. There are a lot of guys out there, vets, firefighters, regular dads, who don't get one interview, let alone 10. What makes your struggle more worth hearing than theirs? Harry almost scoffed. Because my struggle exposes a system most people don't even realize exists. People see a fairy tale. I live the prison underneath it. Joe nodded slowly, tapping the table. That's a heavy line. Prison, describe it. Harry leaned forward, shoulders squaring, warming to the drama of his own language. Every move monitored, every word calculated, every relationship dissected. You're not a person. You're an emblem. Even your grief belongs to the public. When my mother died, the world cried more loudly than my own family. The institution decided what I should feel, when I should appear, what I should say. That's not family, Joe. That's machinery. For a brief moment, Joe's expression softened. He'd seen that look before in the eyes of soldiers, addicts, broken fighters, pain and ego tangled together. Okay, Joe said quietly. That part, I believe, losing your mom like that, brutal. No argument. Harry relaxed a fraction. But Joe added, here's where people get hung up. You talk about that pain, but you also throw gasoline on the fire. Interviews, books, you say you want privacy, but then you give the whole world front row seats to your therapy sessions. Can you see why that confuses people? Harry's eyes hardened again. Privacy, he said slowly, as if teaching. A child doesn't mean silence, it means control. I decide what I talk about, that's my right. Joe shrugged. Sure, but it also means people have the right to think, hey, this dude kind of likes the spotlight. And people have the right to be ignorant, Harry replied briskly. Your listeners are free to misunderstand me if that makes them feel better. A beat of silence. Joe blinked just once. Did you just call my listeners ignorant? Harry's mouth curled into a thin smile. I said people who don't understand nuance are ignorant. If that applies to your listeners, that's not my problem. Inside the control room, the producer mouthed the silent woe. Joe let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. Okay, man, that's one way to start. He shifted in his chair, leaning in again. Let's talk about your brother, William. Harry's shoulders tensed, Joe continued. In your book, you talked about fights, shouting, physical stuff. Do you regret putting that out there, or was that another reclaiming your voice moment? Harry's gaze went flat. The only thing I regret is trusting people who never protected me, William included. I didn't expose anything that wasn't already rotting underneath the surface. But he didn't write a book about you, Joe pointed out. You drew first blood in public. Harry's laugh was sharp. Oh, come on. The British press has been writing books about me my entire life. I just finally responded. Funny how the world only calls it too much when I defend myself. Defend, Joe repeated. Or attack, Harry's eyes flashed, spoken like someone who's never been hunted by cameras from the age of 12. Easy to sit in your Texas studio and moralize. Joe's expression cooled. I don't moralize. I ask questions. Right, Harry snapped. Questions package as judgment. You're not fooling anyone. The mood in the studio shifted again, the energy thickening. Joe's show was used to heated debates. Vaccines, politics, aliens, you name it. But this was different. This wasn't two guys trading ideas over cigars. This was a man dragging the entire weight of a monarchy into the room and daring anyone to question his version of events. Joe inhaled slowly. Look, Harry, you came here, remember that. I didn't drag you in. You wanted this platform. I wanted an honest conversation, Harry shot back. Not another performance of let's pretend we're neutral while we interrogate the spare. And I wanted a guest who doesn't automatically assume every question is an attack, Joe replied, their eyes locked. For a brief, dangerous second, it felt less like a podcast and more like the first round of a title fight. Both fighters still on their feet, but already throwing harder than they planned. Joe broke the stare, glancing at his notes, then back at Harry. Okay, he said, let's talk, Meghan, because you knew it was coming. Harry's shoulders squared again. Of course, because the world still can't handle a woman of color marrying into that family without dissecting her every breath. Joe shook his head. It's not about that for a lot of people, man. They see a pattern. Every time something goes wrong, it's the crown, the press, the institution, the racists, the tabloids. It's never you two. Harry's reply came low and icy. That's because we're not the problem. Joe's fingers drummed lightly on the table. Yeah, he said softly. We'll see what people think after they hear the rest of this. And somewhere in that sentence, in that casual challenge, something in Harry's expression shifted from defensive to dangerous. As if he'd decided this wasn't an interview anymore. It was a battleground, and he had just declared war on the host. The air inside the studio had shifted, thick, electric, almost humming with an invisible voltage. The neon lights behind Joe flickered subtly, as if reacting to the tension between the two men. Joe sat back in his chair, elbows on the armrests, fingers interlaced. Across from him, Harry leaned forward, arms crossed, jaw tight, wearing the expression of someone who believed he was being persecuted rather than interviewed. Joe cleared his throat. All right, he said calmly. We were talking about Meghan. You said people dissect her every breath. But I want to ask something simple. Do you think any criticism of her is valid, or is every negative story automatically part of some conspiracy? Harry inhaled sharply, eyes narrowing. When you're married to a woman as powerful and misunderstood as Meghan, he began, his tone dripping with superiority. Criticism is rarely about facts. It's about jealousy, ignorance, and racism. Joe rubbed his forehead. Man, that's a heavy generalization. You're telling me millions of people across different countries all have the same motives. Millions of uninformed people. Harry shrugged. Yes, it happens. Joe gave a single tired laugh. You hear how that sounds, right? Like you think everyone who doesn't agree with you is beneath you. Harry smirked. If they're repeating tabloid nonsense, then yes, they are. Inside the control room, the producer muttered under his breath. He's unbelievable. Joe leaned in again. Listen, dude, not everyone who disagrees with you hates you. Sometimes people just point out contradictions, like how you and Meghan moved to America for privacy, but ended up doing documentaries, interviews, podcasts. Harry cut him off, voice rising just a notch. You don't get to lecture me about my choices. Privacy doesn't mean hiding. It means choosing how much access you give people. Joe nodded slowly. Okay. So let me ask you this directly. If you hate the press so much, if you think the institution is toxic, if you want control, then why do you keep doing interviews? Harry didn't hesitate. Because I deserve to be heard. My story deserves space, and frankly, people like you need to hear it. Joe blinked. People like me. Harry tilted his head, his smile sharpening. Yes, Joe, People who sit in soundproof studios judging folks who actually lived through trauma. People who think a few UFC fights and a Spotify contract qualify them to analyze centuries of monarchy. Joe's eyebrows climbed. Damn, he murmured, that's something. But Harry wasn't done. You want to dissect my marriage, my family, my decisions, but you've never experienced anything close to my reality. You talk about humility, but you expect me to bow to you in this room. Joe leaned back, arms spread. Harry, I don't expect you to bow to anybody. I'm literally sitting here having a conversation. You're the one turning it into a firefight. Harry scoffed. Maybe because you're not used to interviewing someone who challenges you? Joe nodded. True, usually my guests don't insult my audience. Harry shrugged. Maybe your audience should toughen up. A sharp exhale came from behind the glass. Even the air conditioning sounded louder. Joe held up a hand. All right, let's shift again. Talk to me about William. No drama, just a straight question. When's the last time you spoke to him? Harry's lips pulled into a tight line. Why should I answer that? Because you wrote about him in your book, Joe replied. Because you've spoken about him in interviews. Because the world is curious, man. Harry rolled his eyes. The world is always curious. The world always wants more from me. They want details, conflict, pain, and people like you feed that appetite. Joe nodded. Maybe, but you feed it too. You brought him up. You said he attacked you, shoved you, broke your necklace. Do you stand by all that? Harry's eyes flared, every word. And you don't see how putting that out publicly might have, I don't know, made reconciliation harder. Harry stiffened. Reconciliation isn't possible when one side refuses to acknowledge their wrongdoing. But forgiveness doesn't come with conditions, Joe replied. Sometimes you give it even if the other person doesn't say sorry. Harry snapped. I'm not Jesus, Joe. I'm not here to be saintly. I'm here to protect myself. Joe opened his hands again. Protect yourself or punish them. Harry's tone dropped colder than before. Punish. I don't punish, I reveal. If the truth hurts them, that's their burden. Joe rubbed his face, exasperated. Man, has anyone in your life ever told you maybe you're part of the problem? Harry bristled instantly. That's what weak people say when they can't accept the truth. There it was, the line that made even Joe lean back and stare. Wow, Joe whispered. So now anyone who questions you is weak. Harry didn't blink. If the shoe fits. Joe's jaw tightened. This was the moment the dynamic shifted when the host stopped seeing a guest and started seeing a runaway ego spiraling out of control. He sighed heavily. Okay, all right. Let's talk about something else before this turns into a shouting match. Harry smirked. It already has. You just don't want to admit you're losing control of your own show. The control room froze. Joe's eyes narrowed. Oh, he said quietly. You think that's what's happening here? Harry shrugged again, settled back in his chair, arms crossed. I've dealt with tougher interrogations. If this is the best you've got, I'm not impressed. Joe stared at him for a long moment, lips pressed together as he slowly inhaled through his nose. And for the first time in the entire interview, Joe Rogan looked genuinely irritated. The studio air had become thick enough to cut with a knife. Joe Rogan sat in silence for a moment, leaning back in his chair, trying to calibrate himself before things spiraled completely out of control. The producers behind the glass were frozen, staring at the monitors like they were watching a car crash in slow motion. Prince Harry, however, looked perfectly satisfied, chin lifted, arms crossed, wearing the smug expression of someone who believed he just scored a point in an argument that hadn't even started. Joe exhaled through his nose. All right, he said carefully. Let's get back on track, Harry smirked. I didn't realize we left the track. Joe ignored the jab. So, Harry, let me ask you something about responsibility. Responsibility. Harry repeated with an amused scoff. That's rich coming from you. Joe held up a hand. Dude, this isn't a sparring match. I'm just trying to have a conversation. Harry leaned forward, voice sharp. No, Joe, you're trying to corner me. Same tactic as everyone else. Ask a loaded question. Wait for me to react, then act surprised. Joe closed his eyes for half a second. Okay, forget responsibility. Let's talk about the book. Harry's expression shifted instantly, pride mixed with irritation. Joe continued, in Spare, you revealed some seriously personal stuff about your brother, your father, even your frostbite situation. A few quiet chuckles leaked from the crew. Harry glared in their direction. Joe pressed on. Do you regret sharing any of that now that some time has passed? Harry answered with icy confidence. No, everything I wrote needed to be said. Joe raised his brows. Even the part about William knocking you to the floor over Meghan. Harry's jaw tightened. Yes, especially that part. And the necklace breaking and the dog bowl. Joe, Harry snapped. If you're going to mock my trauma, this conversation is over. Joe's voice stayed calm. I'm not mocking anything. I'm asking if maybe, just maybe, you overshared. Harry scoffed loudly. Overshared? That's the problem with the world. Everyone's too sensitive. How else was I supposed to tell my story? Whisper it to myself in the mirror. Joe leaned forward, elbows on his knees. No one's asking you to hide. But there's a difference between being open and dumping every private detail to the public. Harry shrugged. The public deserves the truth. Joe blinked. Dude, the public doesn't deserve anything from your family's private life. Harry barked a laugh. Says the man whose entire career is based on broadcasting conversations. Behind the glass, one of the producers whispered, "He's unreal." Joe fought the urge to roll his eyes. Look, man. You keep calling yourself a truth teller. You say you're free, but honestly, you sound angry. You sound bitter. Harry leaned back, crossing his legs like a king on a throne. I am enlightened, Joe. That's why it irritates people like you. I don't play by your rules. Joe gestured around the room. You're literally playing by my rules right now. This is my studio. Harry smirked, and yet you seem threatened. Joe paused. It was subtle. But that sentence, and yet you seem threatened, snapped something unspoken in the room. Joe slowly set his headphones down. Threatened, he repeated softly. By you, Harry shrugged. You're getting flustered. Joe blinked slowly. All right, let's talk about William again. Harry's face darkened instantly. No, the word came sharp and stiff. That topic is closed. Joe pressed gently. Why? You've been open about everything else. Harry growled under his breath. Because I'm tired of you people asking me the same questions. William this, William that. Maybe talk about my achievements for once. Joe gave him a long, incredulous stare. Okay, what achievement would you like to talk about? Harry hesitated for a second, just long enough for Joe to notice. Then Harry snapped. You wouldn't understand. Joe leaned back, folding his arms. Try me. Harry straightened in his seat, posture stiff, chin high. I've built a global platform. I've redefined what it means to be a modern royal. I've exposed corruption. I've inspired millions. Joe stared at him. Did you, though? Harry's nostrils flared. What's that supposed to mean? Joe kept his voice even. I mean, when people think of you now, they don't talk about your accomplishments. They talk about the interviews, the drama, the fights, the complaints. Harry pointed a finger at him, because the media twisted everything. Joe lifted his hands. I'm not the media. I'm one guy asking you questions you agreed to answer. Harry rolled his eyes again. You Americans are all the same. That was it. The room shifted. Everyone felt it. Joe leaned in, voice dropping lower. What's that supposed to mean? Harry shrugged casually. Blind patriotism, loud opinions, no understanding of real monarchy. You worship celebrities and pretend it makes you important. Joe blinked once, twice. Then he sat back in his chair, his tone suddenly colder. Harry, be careful, Harry chuckled. Arrogantly careful of what? You, Joe didn't smile. No, careful you don't lose whatever sympathy you have left. Harry flicked a hand dismissively. I don't need sympathy from peasants. The control room froze. 2 camera operators stiffened. A silence slammed down like a hammer. Joe slowly leaned forward. Peasants, he repeated, almost whispering. That what you think of people? Harry's smirk didn't fade, if the word fits. Joe inhaled deeply. You do realize you're not in a palace, right? You're in Texas in my studio with my team with regular people. Harry shrugged, and Joe lowered his voice to a near growl. You're not doing yourself any favors, man. Harry laughed softly. I don't need favors. I'm Prince Harry. And for a second, just a second, Joe looked like he was genuinely considering ending the interview right then and there, but instead he said, Let's take a break. Harry smirked triumphantly. I thought you'd say that. Joe didn't reply. He just stood up and walked off camera for the first time in the entire interview. Harry's smirk wavered. The break felt like an hour, though it lasted barely 4 minutes. The studio pulsed with a different kind of energy now. Not tension, but anticipation. The crew whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Harry, who sat alone at the table, still perfectly smug, still tapping his fingers like he was waiting for servants to return with tea. But Joe Rogan was nowhere near that table. He stood just off camera, arms crossed, talking quietly with a producer who looked pale. You sure you want to finish this? The producer whispered. Joe exhaled through his nose, eyes fixed on Harry. We're finishing this, he said, but on my terms. When he walked back toward the table, the change in him was visible. He wasn't the relaxed, laughing host anymore. This Joe Rogan was still calm, but in the way a storm is calm, right before it hits, he sat down, adjusted his mic, and stared at Harry for a long moment. We good? He asked. Harry smirked. I don't know, Joe, are you good? You seemed awfully flustered before. Joe ignored the provocation. Let's keep going. The cameras flicked back on. Joe leaned forward. Harry, before the break, you called the public peasants. You understand how Harry cut him off with a scoff. Oh, for God's sake, you Americans can't take a joke. It was sarcasm, Joe. Joe raised a brow. You said it 3 times. Harry flicked a hand. Well, some truths slip out when one's exhausted. Joe stared at him. So you meant it. Harry's eyes narrowed. I think people need to stop being so dramatic about words. Joe pressed. And you don't see how calling ordinary people peasants might reflect badly on you? Harry leaned back with theatrical boredom. If people are offended, maybe they should examine why the word fits. A couple of crew members exchanged stunned looks. One whispered, "He's digging his own grave." Joe exhaled deeply, too deeply. "Harry, do you hear yourself?" Harry shrugged. "I hear someone speaking honestly, something the world clearly isn't used to." Joe's patience thinned visibly. "All right, let's talk about Meghan." Harry's eyes sharpened instantly, voice turning defensive. "What about Meghan?" Joe stayed calm. "There have been rumors." Harry leaned forward sharply. "Rumors you will not repeat." Joe didn't flinch. "You came here to talk, Harry. I talk to everyone the same way. Musicians, comedians, presidents. If there's something big in the news, then ignore it," Harry snapped. "Stop feeding the tabloids' obsession with my wife." Joe folded his hands. "I'm not feeding anything. I'm asking questions. It's what a host does." Harry gave a cold laugh. "No, Joe, what you're doing is trying to corner me for entertainment. You want a moment. You want a meltdown. That's why I shouldn't have come back. Then why did you come back?" Joe asked, tone suddenly sharper. Harry froze. Joe stared him down. "Seriously, if all you do is blame everyone around you, why show up?" Harry straightened, nostrils flaring. "Because people deserve to hear my truth." At that, Joe actually laughed, a short, humorless exhale. "Man, every time you say that, you sound less like a truth teller and more like someone who can't stand being questioned." Harry's jaw clenched. "I won't be disrespected by mediocrity, Joe." Joe's eyes snapped up. The room froze. "Mediocrity," Joe repeated slowly. Harry lifted his chin. "Don't act surprised. You're not exactly interviewing heads of state." Joe leaned in, voice low. "I've interviewed astronauts, neuroscientists, war heroes, philosophers, and legends. But I've never had someone sit here, insult everyone in the room, and act like the world owes him something." Harry smirked. "The world does owe me something." Joe stared at him, stunned. "You." "Serious?" Harry lifted both hands. "I was born into duty, into expectations, into a system that suffocated me. The least people can do is understand my pain." Joe blinked slowly. "Harry, you're living in a mansion in Montecito." Harry shrugged. "And does comfort erase pain? You Americans are so obsessed with money. You equate wealth with happiness. It's pathetic, honestly." Joe inhaled through his teeth. "Okay, enough." Harry smirked. "Touch a nerve." Joe sat forward, elbows on the table, voice deadly calm. "You called people peasants. You insulted my staff. You trashed the audience. You mocked Americans. You insulted me." Harry's smile widened. So, Joe repeated, incredulous. "So you're lucky anyone even listens to you anymore." Harry scoffed. "Please, the world hangs on my every word." Joe shook his head. "No, man, they watch you the way people watch a building about to collapse." Harry's face hardened. "Enough, Joe." Joe didn't stop. "You know the difference between you and every other guest I've had on this show. Even when people disagree with me, there's mutual respect. But you came in here acting like you're above basic decency." Harry stood up abruptly. There it was, the crack. "Don't talk to me like that." Harry snapped. "I am Prince Harry." Joe stood up too. "No, you're Harry, just Harry, a guy sitting in my studio acting like the world owes him reverence." Harry pointed at him. "You're crossing a line." Joe took one step closer, voice final. "No, you crossed every line 10 minutes into this interview." Harry's eyes flared. "Are you threatening me?" Joe shook his head. "I'm ending this." Harry blinked, stunned. "Ending? What do you mean ending?" Joe pointed toward the exit. "This interview is over." Harry's mouth fell open. "You're kicking me out." Joe stared at him. "This isn't Buckingham Palace. This isn't the Royal Press Corps. This is my studio, my show, and you don't get to disrespect everyone here and walk away like a hero." Harry sputtered, voice rising. "You can't do that. I came here to lecture the world." Joe snapped. "To insult people. To play the victim again?" Harry froze. Joe lowered his voice, but the intensity remained. "You came here looking for a fight. Congratulations. You found the wrong guy." Harry shook with rage. "You'll regret this, Rogan." Joe shrugged. "Maybe, but right now, you need to leave." Harry ripped off his mic, slamming it on the table, and stormed out of the studio. Not with dignity, not with grace, but with the fury of a man who had lost control of the narrative. The moment the door shut behind him, the room exhaled collectively. Joe sat back down, rubbing his temples. "Well," he muttered to the camera, "that was something." Then he looked straight into the lens. Harry wanted a platform. He got one, but platforms don't protect you from the truth. Fade to black. If you enjoyed this unbelievable clash between Prince Harry and Joe Rogan, make sure to hit that like button. subscribe, and turn on notifications, because more shocking confrontations, exposed egos, and behind-the-scenes drama are coming your way. Drop a comment below and tell us whose side you're on.